The hammer came down on his mother's face for the third time that morning, and the Duke of Yardley did not flinch, because flinching was the one luxury he could no longer afford. Lot 51, the auctioneer called, tapping the gilt frame with his stick as though it were a crate of turnips. A lady's portrait, artist unknown, frame somewhat rubbed. Who begins me at £5? Artist unknown. Ambrose Aldis, 9th Duke of Yardley, stood at the back of his own long gallery among strangers in wet boots and knew the artist's name, and the day the man had come to Elverton Hall, and the way his mother had laughed at being made to sit still for 6 mornings together in the blue gown she had worn to her wedding. The painter had given her a half smile because he could not catch the whole of it. Nobody had ever caught the whole of it. £5, said a voice near the windows. 4, then. It is a very brown picture. Laughter went along the row of chairs where the fashionable had come to watch a duke be taken apart. They had driven out from town for it. They had brought their opera glasses. Lady Ferring had brought a hamper. Ambrose kept his hands behind his back and his chin level, and let the cold morning light from the high windows fall on him, and did not move. He had been told by his man of business that his presence at the sale would be thought dignified. He had come to learn that his man of business was a fool. There was no dignity in this. There was only a room he had learned to walk in before he could speak, stripped down to bare boards and dust hanging in the light like something burning very slowly, and his father's debts laid open on a trestle table, and his mother going under the hammer at £4 because her frame was somewhat rubbed. He could not bid. That was the whole of it, plainly. Every coin he could raise was pledged against the mortgages by the end of the month, and the auction itself was the creditor's work. And if the Duke of Yardley were seen to buy back his own goods with money owed to other men, he would be a thief as well as a pauper. His attorney had explained it to him twice, gently, the way one explains a thing to a man standing on a ledge. £4, then, the auctioneer said. 4 I have. 4.10 anywhere. 4.10, drawled Mr. Peverell, who dealt in such pictures and sold them to men who wanted ancestors. He did not even look up. He was cleaning his spectacles. Ambrose watched his mother's painted hand, the one that had rested on his head at every parting of his life, and found that his own hands, behind his back, had closed so hard that the signet ring was cutting into his finger. The ring was entailed. They could not take the ring. It was, he thought with a bitterness that surprised him, the only piece of his family that the law had troubled to protect. £5, said a woman's voice. The room turned. Ambrose turned with it, and did not, at first, find her, because he was looking at the height a lady's voice comes from, and she was standing behind the last row of chairs, near the door, where the servants and the curious stood. She was young, and she was poor, and she was making no attempt to disguise either fact. Her gown had been grey once and was now the colour of a rainy afternoon. Her shawl was worn to a gauze at one shoulder where a strap or a yoke had rubbed it for years. Her boots were honest and cracked. Her hair had been put up with great care and no pins to spare, and a strand of it had come loose at her temple, and she did not put it back. She stood very straight, the way people stand when standing straight is the only thing they own outright, and she was holding her closed hand against the front of her ribs as if something living were inside it. £5, the auctioneer repeated, in the tone of a man deciding whether to be amused. From the young person at the back. Yes, she said. Lady Ferring said something behind her glove, and the row of chairs rippled with laughter, and Mr. Peverell finally looked up, saw what he was bidding against, smiled. 5.10, he said. The woman's chin came up an inch. £6. Ambrose heard his own breath go. He did not know her. He had never seen her face in his life, and he would have remembered it, he thought, and the thought was so strange and so sudden in the middle of his ruin that he took hold of the back of a chair. £6.10, said Peverell, bored. 7, she said. This is charming, said a gentleman near the fireplace loudly. The parish is bidding. £7, said the auctioneer. £7 for the brown lady, Mr. Peverell? Peverell tilted his head, looking at the portrait, doing his sum. A rubbed frame, an unknown hand. A woman with a half-smile, nobody's ancestor now. He shrugged. She may have it, he said. I dare say she means to hang it in her kitchen. Going at £7, said the auctioneer. £7 once, twice. The hammer came down. Ambrose did not remember crossing the room. Afterwards he could never account for those few seconds. There was the sound of the hammer, and then he was standing at the trestle table where the clerk sat with the cash box, close enough to see her hands. She was counting money out onto the cloth. She counted it slowly, and she counted it in the way that people count who know to a farthing what is there, and are counting for the clerk's sake and not their own. Shillings, sixpences, a few coppers warm and dulled from being carried a long time. She set them down in ranks like a general who has no reserve. £6, 19 shillings and 11 pence. She stopped. She turned her closed hand over and opened it, and in the bare palm was a single coin, and she looked at it for the space of one breath. One only he saw it, one breath in which a whole life was weighed and something was given up forever, and then she put it down on the cloth with the others. £7, she said. That is all of it. Very good, said the clerk, not looking at her. She stood with her empty hand still open and closed it and lowered it, and something went out of her shoulders and came back again, and she said, quite steadily, might the picture be given to me now, if you please? I have not. I should like it now. The porters brought the portrait down and set it on its feet against the table, and it was taller than she was. His mother looked out over the young woman's shoulder at the ruin of her house with a half-caught smile, and Ambrose stood 4 feet away and could not speak. The stranger turned around, holding the frame with both hands, and saw him, and he understood in that instant that she had known exactly where he was standing for the whole of the last 10 minutes and had refused to look. Colour came up her throat, but she did not falter. She walked to him, the room going quiet in patches, the way a field goes quiet, and she held the picture out. Your Grace, she said. This is yours, he heard himself say. Madam. It is yours, she said again, more firmly, as if he had misheard rather than misunderstood. And she pushed it toward him, and he had to take it or let it fall, and so he took it, and for one moment both their hands were on the gilt of the frame, hers bare and reddened, his gloved, and he could feel the cold of her fingers through the leather, and the tremor in them, and he could not, for the life of him, let go. You have given me £7, he said. His voice did not sound like his own. You have given me everything you had. I have given you a picture, she said. Nothing else was mine to give. Your name. She hesitated. Thomasin Beck. Miss Beck. He said it as though he were learning a text. Why? And she looked up at him, and her eyes were grey and perfectly clear and not at all soft. And she said, because a man ought to keep his mother. The dust turned in the light between them. Somewhere behind, Lady Ferring said distinctly, how very affecting, and someone laughed, and Ambrose did not hear it as anything but weather. You cannot afford this, he said. No, said Miss Beck. Then let me. No. It came out fast, and her chin went up again, and there it was. The whole of her, plain as a wall. She would take the laughter of every fine person in that room. She would walk out of Elverton Hall with nothing but the shawl on her shoulders and the mud on her boots, and she would not take his money. You will want to pay me back, she said. You will want to do it at once before you have thanked me, so that you need not be obliged. I know how it goes with great men. Your Grace, you have not a shilling that is not spoken for. The whole county knows it. You cannot pay me back, and if you could, you would be taking the only thing I have done in my life that was entirely my own. She drew a breath. So do not, please. He stood holding his mother's portrait in a room where his childhood was being sold in lots, and looked at a woman with nothing, who had just made herself poorer than she already was in order to hand him back the one thing that could not be replaced, and who was now asking him, with her hand shaking and her voice quite level, for the favour of not being thanked in money. Something in him that had been standing rigid for 11 months, since his father's funeral, since the first letter from the bank, since the night he had understood the true size of the whole, something that had held and held because there was nobody in the world to hold it for him, gave way. Miss Beck, he said, and stopped and began again. There is a room at the end of this gallery. There is nothing in it. They have sold the chairs. Will you come and stand in it with me for 5 minutes? Her lips parted. Your Grace, I ought. 5 minutes, he said. That is all. Then, if you wish it, you may walk out of my house, and I will never speak to you again. And I will keep my mother's picture and think of you every day of my life, which will be a poor return for £7, but it is what I have. The dust hung in the light. Behind them the auctioneer began on lot 52, which was the clock from the nursery landing. 5 minutes, said Thomason Beck. The morning room at the end of the gallery had been his mother's. They had taken the chairs and the writing table and little rosewood cabinet, and left the curtains, because the curtains were faded and nobody wanted them. The light came through them, the colour of weak tea. Ambrose set the portrait against the wall, where it had hung for 30 years, and the shape of it fitted the clean square in the paper exactly, and he stood back and looked at it, and then he looked at her. Thomason Beck stood just inside the door with her hands folded. She had not sat, because there was nothing to sit on, and she had not made a joke about it, and he liked her better for that than he could account for. "You will want to know who I am," she said. "Then you will feel easier." "I want to know who you are," he said, "but it will not make me easier." "Nothing is going to make me easier today." Her mouth moved, not a smile, but the place a smile is kept. "My father was clerk to your father's steward. 11 years, at the desk under the stairs in the estate office. Beck. You will not remember him. You were at school and he was a small man in a brown coat." "Beck," said Ambrose slowly. "He wrote a very fine hand." She looked up sharply. "He did. There are ledgers of his in the muniment room. They are the only ones a man can read." He had spent 3 nights of that terrible winter over them, tracing his father's ruin backward through years, and had come, more than once, on a small dry note in that beautiful hand. "This sum is not accounted for. This sum is not accounted for." Nobody had listened to him. He died 9 years ago in the spring, and my mother was ill, and there was no money for burying him, and the Duchess sent word that the estate would bury him, and she came herself in the rain to the church at Padwick and stood at the back. And afterwards she took my mother's hand and said that a man who keeps honest books has done more for a great house than most of its friends. Thomason's voice had gone very careful, the way one carries a full cup. "She said it to my mother, not to me. I was standing behind." Ambrose said nothing. His mother had never once mentioned it. That was entirely like her. "So you see," said Thomason, "it was not for you." "No," he said. "You have made that very plain. It was not a debt, either." She said it fiercely, as if he had argued. "A kindness is not a debt. If it were, it would only be trade with better manners. Nobody owed anybody anything. She was kind because she was kind, and today I could buy her back, and so I did, and it is finished, and then there is nothing owing between us, and you must not look at me like that, Your Grace." "How am I looking at you?" "As though you were about to do something rash," said Thomason Beck. Through the wall came the auctioneer's voice, muffled, selling the nursery clock. £9. The clock fetched more than his mother. He would think about that later, in the small hours, for years. Ambrose crossed the room. He stopped a proper distance away, the width of a chair that was no longer there, and he found that his heart was going like a boy's. "Miss Beck," he said, 11 months ago my father died and left me a title, a house, and £81,000 of debt. Since then I have been spoken to with sympathy by men who were computing how much of me was left. I have been dined by 3 separate families who wished to purchase a duchess's coronet for a daughter, cash down, debts assumed. I have been advised, condoled with, and appraised. Not one living soul has given me anything." He heard his own voice roughen and did not trouble to stop it. "You had £7. You had, I think, no assurance of any more. And you spent it on a stranger's mother, and then you refused to be thanked, because being thanked would have made it smaller." "It would," she whispered. "Then permit me to say the only thing that is not smaller." He drew a breath. "Marry me." The silence went on so long that he heard the hammer fall twice through the wall. "That," said Thomason Beck at last, "is the rashest thing I have ever heard a man say." "It is. You do not know me." "I have known you 11 minutes, and I know the shape of you all through, which is more than I can say for men I was at school with." He took 1 step nearer. "Miss Beck, look about this room. It is bare. In 3 weeks the bank may have the house itself, and if it does not, it will be because I have sold every stick of timber on the home farm and taken the quarry lease at Grindleback into my own hands and worked it, and lived in the steward's cottage with 2 servants and a dog. That is what I am offering. There is no coach. There is no settlement. There is a name that is presently a joke in every drawing room between here and town, and there is a man who will be very poor for a very long time." He stopped. "And there is this, that if you say yes, I will spend the whole of that long time seeing to it that you are never cold again, and never laughed at twice, and never once sorry." She had gone white. "They will say I did it for the title. They will. They will say I bought you at auction for £7, said Thomasin, and her voice cracked straight down the middle, "and that is the cheapest a duke has ever gone." "Yes," said Ambrose. "And you and I will know that you gave the £7 away and asked for nothing, and that I came after you, and that I would have come after you if you had been the richest woman in England, and slower and worse." Her hands were shaking. She put them behind her back. "I cannot say yes to you in an empty room in the middle of an auction," she said. "It is not, your grace, it is not decent, and it is not sensible, and I have not eaten since yesterday, and I do not trust anything a man says to me on a day like this, including anything I say back." He should have been mortified. Instead, something rose in him like sun coming through cloud on the moor, sudden and unreasonable. "Then eat," he said, "and say no to me tomorrow, and I shall ask again on Thursday." "Your Grace, Ambrose," he said, "there is no one left to overhear." She looked at him for a long moment, and the loose strand of hair moved at her temple, and she did not put it back, and he knew he would remember this room for the whole of his life, except that he did not think it in words at all, for he had stopped thinking in words, and only stood there with his mother's smile at his shoulder, looking at her. "Thursday," said Thomasin Beck, and went out. He stayed where he was until the sound of the crowd had moved down into the hall. Then he went to the trestle table where the clerk was strapping the cash box, and asked, in the voice he used to men in banks, to see the takings of lot 51. The clerk, who had been at the sale of 2 other ruined houses that season, and was not a hard man, tipped the coins into a tray. Ambrose picked out a shilling, worn nearly smooth, warm still, with a bright new nick in the rim. He set a shilling of his own in its place, and put hers in his waistcoat pocket, and did not take it out again for a very long time. The county had a fortnight of it, and used the fortnight well. At Padwick Assembly Rooms they said the Duke of Yardley had lost his estate and his wits together. Lady Ferring told the story at 4 dinners, improving it each time, and by the 4th telling, Miss Beck had bid with money got by pawning her dead father's boots, and had thrown herself at the Duke's feet in the gallery, and had been raised up by him in front of 40 witnesses, weeping. £7, Lady Ferring would say, holding up her glass. "One does like to know one's price." Mr. Peverell, who dealt in ancestors, remarked that the picture was worth 11 guineas, and that the girl had shown a sound eye and a sounder ambition. His aunt came out from town on the Wednesday. Lady Cordelia Aldis was 68 and had buried 2 husbands and a great deal of feeling. She walked into the muniment room where he was working, his coat off, his sleeves turned back, the quarry's surveys spread over the floor because there was no table, and she stood in the door and looked at him for a while. "So it is true," she said. "You have gone mad in the ordinary way, aunt." A clerk's daughter, a charity case, a creature who stood up in your own gallery, in front of the Ferrings, in a shawl one would not use to wrap fish, and made a spectacle of your mother's portrait. And now the whole county is telling the story of how the Duke of Yardley was brought back like a chair. She sat down on the window seat, being the only person in the house able to find a seat. "Ambrose, Sir Julian Sowerby will call on you tomorrow." He kept his eyes on the survey. "Sowerby holds 4 of the mortgages. Sowerby holds you. He will offer to lift the whole of it, the whole, Ambrose, 81,000, and to lay out 10 more on the roof and the drains, and in exchange you will marry Augusta, who is a perfectly good-tempered girl who plays the harp indifferently and will give you no trouble whatever." Lady Cordelia's voice, for one instant, was not hard at all. "You would be a duke again. You would have Elverton. You would have your mother's picture on that wall, and a fire under it, and nothing sold ever again." Ambrose stood up. He went to the window and looked out over the park at the beeches his great-grandfather had planted, which he had that morning marked to be felled, 300 of them, because a man must pay what he owes. "Aunt," he said, "when my father died, how many people wrote to me? A great many. They wrote to the Duke of Yardley. Not one of them wrote to me." He turned around. A fortnight ago a woman with nothing in the world spent the last coin she had on a picture of a woman she had spoken to once, and put it in my hands, and would not let me pay her, and walked home 11 miles in the rain. Lady Cordelia was quiet. 11 miles, said Ambrose. I did not know that until Tuesday. She would not take the gig. That, said his aunt at last, is not an argument. No, he agreed. It is a great deal better than one. Sir Julian Sowerby came on the Thursday morning, an hour before Ambrose had meant to ride to Padwick, and he came in a coach with 4 horses when a pair would have done, which told the Duke of Yardley everything he needed to know before the man was out of it. They talked in the muniment room, standing, because there was nowhere to sit but the window seat, and Ambrose did not offer it. Sowerby was kind. That was the worst of it. He was a broad, comfortable, sorrowful man who said, "My dear Duke, and these hard times, and your poor father, God rest him," and who laid the figures out on the floor beside the quarry surveys with his own hands in ink, so that Ambrose might see how simple it was. 81,000 lifted. The beaches standing, the roof mended before the winter. Augusta was very fond of the country, and in return, Ambrose said. In return, said Sir Julian, a family is joined to a name, and my grandson is a duke, and nobody is ruined. I have never understood why gentlemen make such faces over an arrangement. Your own grandfather married a brewer's daughter with £90,000 and lived very happy. He did, said Ambrose. She died of it in 9 years, and he never spoke her name once at his own table. I have his letters. There is not a line in them that is not about money. Sir Julian's face did not change, but his eyes did. There is a story going about, he said, concerning a young person and a picture. My dear Duke, forgive me. It does you credit to be moved. Men are moved. But a duke cannot be moved in public, and a duke certainly cannot marry a thing he was moved by. He gathered up his papers, unhurried. She spent £7. I am offering to spend 91,000. Let us be honest with one another about which of us loves you better. Ambrose walked to the window. Down on the drive the 4 horses stamped in their harness, and beyond them the beeches stood in the wind with the felling marks bright on their trunks, and further off, 11 miles away over the rise and past the mill and down into the grey little town. There was a woman with cracked boots mending other people's linen for 4pence a day, who had asked him, with her hand shaking, not to pay her. Sir Julian, he said, you have named a price for me twice this morning, and you have been perfectly civil about it both times, and I am obliged to you, because until this fortnight I did not know there was any other way to be spoken to. He turned. The lady you speak of gave me the only thing she had, and refused to be repaid. You are offering me £91,000 and asking to be repaid in my whole life. Now go home. He kept his voice quite level. He had been told since he was 9 that Aldous kept his voice level. Sowerby went out, and the coach turned on the gravel, and Ambrose stood in the empty room with his heart hammering like a boy's for the 2nd time in a fortnight, and understood, with a kind of terror, that he was now poorer than he had been at breakfast and happier than he had been in a year. He rode to Padwick and found her in the yard behind the White Hart, up to her elbows in a copper of linen, with her sleeves turned back and steam in her hair. Miss Beck. She did not startle. She wrung out a sheet and hung it and wiped her hands on her apron and only then looked at him, and her face went through something so quick and so unguarded that he had to look away, at the wall, at the sky, at anything. It is Thursday, she said. It is. You said you would ask again on Thursday. I did. He got down. He held his hat in his hands like a farmer. Miss Beck, an hour ago I refused £91,000. It is possible that in refusing it I have lost Elverton Hall, and the beeches, and my name's credit, and it is certain that I have made an enemy who will tell the story his own way in every club in town. I have never in my life done anything so foolish, and I would do it again this afternoon, and twice tomorrow. He stopped. Marry me. Thomasin Beck stood in the steam with a wet sheet in her hands and tears standing in her eyes, and did not let one of them fall. They will be cruel to you, she said. They are cruel to me now, and I am alone. I would rather be laughed at with you. I have no money. I have no family. I have one gown that is not this one, and it is not much better, and I do not know how to be a duchess, and I will get it wrong in front of people who are waiting for me to get it wrong. Then get it wrong, said Ambrose. Get it gloriously wrong. I will stand next to you while you do it, and they may make what they like of that. Her mouth was trembling. She pressed it flat. And if you had been rich, she said. If you had been the Duke of Yardley with 80,000 a year and every window in that house lit, would you have crossed the room to a woman in a shawl like this? He thought about it honestly, because she deserved an honest answer and not a gallant one. No, he said. She flinched. No, he said again, because I would have been a fool, and I would have gone on being a fool, and I would have married Miss Sowerby and been civil to her for 40 years and died without ever once having been given anything. He took a step closer into the steam, and it was warm. And it smelled of soap and coal and her. It took the whole of my ruin to make me fit to see you. That is not a thing I am proud of, but it is the truth, and I have nothing else left to offer you but the truth, so here it is. I do not want to be saved, Thomasin. I want to be yours. If we lose the house, we shall lose the house. Come and lose it with me. The sheet fell back into the copper. She put her hand up, one hand, still wet, still red, and laid it flat against the front of his coat, over the pocket where the shilling was, and stood there with her head down and her breath going in and out. Yes, said Thomasin Beck. He did not kiss her. He put his own hand over hers and held it there, and they stood in the yard behind the White Hart in a cloud of steam while a dog barked and the ostler pretended to be busy with a bucket, and it was, he thought afterwards, the single best minute of his life. They were married in the church at Padwick on a wet morning in October, and the county came. They came in force, and they came for the same reason they had come to the auction, and Lady Faring wore violet and sat where she could be seen. Lady Cordelia Aldis came too, in her second husband's diamonds, and sat rigid in the front pew with her chin up, and nobody could tell what she was thinking, which was precisely as she wished it. Thomasin walked up the aisle in a plain gown of grey silk that she had cut and stitched herself, and she had no one to give her away, so she gave herself, and the whispering ran along the pews like wind in barley. Ambrose heard it. He turned around at the chancel step in front of the whole of them, and he waited for a full half-minute in a silence that got worse and worse, until the whispering died of its own shame. Then he held out his hand, and she took it. At the vestry, when the register was signed and the bells had begun, he did not let her go out. He turned her toward him, and took from his waistcoat pocket the worn shilling with the bright nick in its rim, and put it into her bare palm, and closed her fingers over it. Her eyes came up, furious and wet. You said you would not pay me back, and I have not, said the Duke of Yardley. I have never paid you a farthing, and I never shall, and if you offer me the chance again, I shall refuse it. That is not payment, that is yours. It was the last thing you had, and you gave it away, and a man cannot allow a thing like that to be spent among other coins in a strange box. So he takes it, and keeps it, and gives it back to his wife on her wedding day. And there is no arithmetic in it anywhere. He closed both his hands around hers. You have never owed me anything, Thomasin. You never will. That is the whole of what I have to give you, and it is the only thing in my life that no bank can take. She wept then at last, and he let her and held her, and outside the bells went on and on. The ruin was real. Took them 4 years. They sold the London house and the plate, and 300 beeches came down, and the great rooms at Ilverton stayed shut with the shutters barred. And for 2 winters the Duke and Duchess of Yardley lived in 6 rooms at the end of the east wing with 2 servants and a dog, and burned wood they had cut themselves, and were spoken of in town as a curiosity. The quarry at Grindle was the making of them, though it made them slowly. Ambrose took the lease back and worked it, and learned it, and got a stone contract for the new bridge at Marlbury, and then for the school, and then, in the 4th year, for a mile of viaduct. And Thomasin, who had a clerk's daughter's hands and a clerk's daughter's stubbornness, sat up at night with her father's ledgers. She found it in the 3rd winter, a small dry note in a beautiful hand, on a page nobody had troubled to turn, and then another, and then 11 of them. This sum is not accounted for. She followed the sums the way a hound follows a line, and they led to the old steward, Mr. Hallows, who had retired very comfortably to a house at Rye Cote with a carriage and a gravel sweep, and who had helped himself, over 19 years, to something over £9,000 of a family too proud and too careless to look. They got 7,000 of it back, and the Lork Mr. Hallows and the county, which had laughed at her for 2 years and 11 months, discovered abruptly that the Duchess of Yardley had a head on her. "They will say now that I married you for your ledgers," Ambrose told her at midnight, in the muniment room, with the papers spread on a table they had at last been able to buy. "Let them," said his wife. "It would be the first true thing they've said about us." She was 28 by then, and there were shadows under her eyes from the work, and the fire had burned low, and he looked at her across it and could not have said, at that moment, what any part of his life had been, for before she walked into his gallery in a shawl worn to gauze and bid £7. The shutters came down off the long gallery in the 8th year. They gave a dinner. It was not a grand dinner by the standards of the county, but the fires were lit the length of the room, and the oil lamps were new, and the beeches that had been felled had been replanted, small and hopeful, in a double row down the park. Lady Ferring came because Lady Ferring always came. She stood a long while in front of the portrait at the end of the gallery, a lady in a blue gown with a half-caught smile, in a gilt frame somewhat rubbed, which nobody had ever thought worth mending, and she said to nobody in particular, in her carrying voice, £7. And to think it hangs there still. The room went quiet. Ambrose Aldis, 9th Duke of Yardley, crossed his gallery, and he did not hurry, and he stopped beside his wife, and he took her hand and drew it through his arm and held it there against him, in front of every one of them. £7, he agreed. It is the only sum in the whole history of this house that was honestly come by, generously spent, and never asked back. Everything else you see here, the stone, the roof, the trees, the man standing in front of you, was bought with it. He looked down at Thomasin, and the lamplight was on her face, and she was going pink, and she was not looking away. "Madam, my wife came into this room with nothing and gave me the only things she owned. If any one of you give the same of anything you have ever done, I should be very glad to hear it, and if you cannot, then you will drink her health, and you will do it standing." They drank it standing. Afterwards, when the carriages had gone and the lamps were burning low and the dust turned slowly in the warm light the way it had turned on the morning of the auction, he found her alone under the portrait with her hand at her throat, where, on a black ribbon, she wore a worn shilling with a bright nick in its rim, drilled through by a Padwick jeweller, who had charged them 9p and been paid. Ambrose came and stood behind her, and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and his mother looked down at the pair of them with her half-caught smile. "You have never once let me thank you," he said. "In 8 years. "No," said Thomasin, "and I never shall." "Then I shall have to go on doing it," said the Duke of Yardley, "every day without permission for the rest of my life." She turned her head, and he bent, and outside the high windows the young beeches stood in their double row in the last of the sun, and the house was warm, and the gallery was full of nothing at all but the two of them.